Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the next talk in our series of talks surrounding the current exhibition at Benuri Gallery, and that's Lancelot Ribeiro, Heads in and Out of Our Time, with an accompanying exhibition of heads and other works from the Benuri collection. And one of the artists included in that show is the contemporary artist Hormazd Narielwalla, and I'm delighted to welcome you, Hormazd, this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Great pleasure. So we're going to spend the next 45 minutes to an hour having a chat about your work, and you're going to lead us through your journey artistically and how you came to the UK, and we're going to talk all things art emanating from that. So we've got a lovely introduction slide there, which is actually for your current installation at the Royal Geographical Society, but I know we're going to come to that later. So this will be a kind of circular talk where we end up at that place. But we're going to begin with how we got to Dead Man's Patterns. So if you'd like to just start, Hormazd, by telling us a bit about your background, how you came to the UK in your studies, and then how we made that leap to the Dead Man's Patterns.
Okay, so I used to have a background in fashion. I used to work as a stylist and sometimes a fashion journalist for magazines and newspapers back in Pune, India. And I've always been interested in fashion and artistic expression of my ideas, and I've always been a creative individual. And I finally came to the UK to study fashion in the University of Wales, Newport. And as soon as my degree was over, I came to London, and the University of Westminster calls me up and asks me if I would be interested in doing this new test course that they had come out with, which was run by Shelley Fox and Zoe Broach from Boudica. And the course was really for people who didn't know where they fit in. And it was mainly for fashion people, but they were allowing us freedom of expression in what we did. So some people made installations, some people made films, and I made an artist book. I didn't even know I was making an artist book at the time. I started researching into military tailoring at the National Army Museum, and they told me about Savile Row. And I'd, of course, heard of Savile Row before, but I had not taken, specific attention to it. And on my first very meeting with the tailor at Dejan Skinner, one of the oldest tailors on Savile Row, he told me that when his customers would pass away, they would remove the patterns from the archive and shred them. And this left a very profound effect on me. Of course, they wouldn't shed every person's patterns, but it was basically somebody who's just ordered one suit or two suits in their lifetime. Those ones would obviously take precedence of being removed from the archive simply because of storage issues. Of course, if there was a prominent individual like the Sultan of Oman or Gianni Versace or David Bowie, those people's patterns they would hang on to and they would keep for sure. But I convinced him after meeting him several times to give me the patterns, and he finally succumbed and said, yes, all right, but remove the identity of the customer and you can have the patterns. And this prompted me to make a book called Dead Man's Patterns. And what you see on screen was the edited version of it that I had showcased in my final year, in my sort of end of year exhibition. And people really responded to it as a book and as an object. And the editor of Salvage magazine had seen it, and she said it would be such a shame if you didn't brought it out into the world, make a small edition of 100 and see what the response was. And I was so shocked by how positive the response was, because Paul Smith bought several copies and invited me to exhibit in his Albemarle Street store gallery in
Exciting.
2009. And then the British Library bought a copy, the National Art Library, and 20 other public institutions bought copies. And really that sort of made me think that, okay, maybe I'm not a designer, but I'm an artist. And I was very lucky that someone from the research department at the University of Arts London saw the work and saw my book and said, why don't you come in? And we discussed doing a PhD, and I was the first international scholar to get a scholarship to read on a PhD, which I then finished in 2014, which was basically in the territory of patterns as documents and drawings, but representational blocks of the human body. And that's when I really thought of, myself as an artist. And subsequently, after the PhD, I have just been making art for the last 10 years.
And we can see, obviously, on the backdrop behind you, this interest in pattern continues and how you've used that in your work. But before we move on, although I will go to the next slide from Dead Man's Patterns, just tell us a little bit more about some of the imagery in the book, how you developed that and what you were doing there. What was the kind of thought process? I know you've talked about the kind of concept behind it.
So basically, the patterns, I'm sort of removing them from the context of tailoring and sort of washing their utilitarian aspects of why they were made, because I'm not going to make clothes out of them. I'm not a tailor and I can't make a suit, but I'm sort of trying to bring a new light and a new interpretation from them. So I started seeing them as objects, but they sort of, now that I'm much more, I've been thinking a lot more about patterns than I did 10, 11 years ago, but or 15 years ago, no, actually 17, it's really, time flies. But I started seeing them almost like objects that represented a spirit, so to speak, like they're leaving their mark behind. It's almost like resurrection, where the patterns, they're possibly the only objects that record the human body,
Yes.
besides medical x-rays and other medical related procedures. But they have a sense of memory and history.
Mm.
And although now the bulk of the practice is made on French, German, and Spanish women's wear sewing patterns, I still feel like they represent individuals, because they were made for individuals, and specifically those individuals who are not with us anymore. So there is a feeling of memory and history, and stories of the human condition can be told using these patterns. And um, I don't, I try not to let the patterns take over. I'm still in control of how I tell the stories. Like, I mean, sometimes they follow very strict geometry and a strict geometric language, and sometimes it's much more fluid and expressionist, like the paintings that you see behind me, where they go out of the line, and they're only like a mark for me as an indication of where I should place the paint. But then I am the storyteller, so I feel like I then do what I feel intuitively at the time is the right decision when.
Sure, they're the starting point for the process.
Exactly.
Okay, so if I move us to the next slide, so you got up to sort of 2014 in your own story, and we move here to 2017. And this is a piece that we're very lucky to have in the Benary collection now. And part of it is on display at the moment. But I know that it was a commission originally from the Museum of Migration. So would you like to tell us a bit more how that came about, and also the concept that you were exploring in this piece?
So the commission was for the Migrations Museum, as you said, and they had an exhibition where they wanted to document 7 key moments in British migration. And the one that they gave me was the expulsion of the Jewish population in 1290 by, I believe, King Edward I.
Yeah.
And before the formal expulsion, a systematic form of self-identification was put in place, where Jewish people had to wear 2 strips of yellow on uh, their jackets or on their torsos. So it was the museum was trying to sort of put forward the notion that when the Nazis made Jewish people wear a Star of David for identification, it wasn't the first time that it happened. You know, it happened a century, almost 700 years ago in a similar form. So they wanted me to delve into that. And so I thought that I would also make an artwork with 2 strips. And I then asked, which would be celebratory rather than a derogatory artifact that is putting someone down, and and then obviously other horrific things that came after that. So I decided to sort of look at ways Jewish people were celebrated. And Chef Shofin in Morocco caught my eye, where this whole town is painted in blue, and it was basically Jewish refugees who had moved into the city suggested painting their houses in blue, and then it caught on, and then the whole city is painted in blue. So I thought that was a really beautiful story that I thought, so I'm looking back into history again, but I was looking at a positive story to put forward. And then I asked all my Jewish friends and collectors to supply me with photos of their families and of themselves. And I made this collage using photography and hand-painted papers and papers, all in shades of blue, which that's why I call them the bands of pride. So they're like the 2 bands that, there's a sense of pride rather than a sense of shame or, you know, I wanted it to be a positive piece. And it's actually the only work that I've ever used photography in, and I've never used photography again. So it's quite a special work, and I was really excited to learn when it was accepted by the Benary Museum collection, which was the first museum that had my work in a public collection context.
Well, we're very glad to have it, and it has had a number of iterations. We're not always able to show the whole thing, but we are always keen to show at least 2 pieces from it to keep that idea of the duality there together. And obviously the blue is really celebratory, and it's very interesting that you used photography in this one and only piece, as you say. And I should have commented for any viewers who are less familiar with your work, how obviously what happened with your first kind of encounter with the patterns was that was a very seminal moment, which really had this resonance for your work, that you've developed that using the patterns as the support for your media. So if we move on then to Birds of Passage from 2022, And as you tell us about it, I think we've got about 5 slides here, and I'm just going to flick through them so that people can see, as it were, how this artist's book is formed and opened and the various parts it consists of. This again is on display in the current show, but perhaps you can tell us more about it, Hormazd.
Sure. So this book came after a series of work that I did called Rock, Paper, Scissors that was inspired by Hepworth and my visit to the Hepworth Garden in St. Ives. And after the series was made, and this was made during lockdown, so it would have been the concept would have started in 21. And my partner, he made little sculptures mimicking my interpretation of Hepworth. And he made cyanotypes, really little ones, by putting the sculptures in the sun, and they left shadows behind, and then gave them to me and said, do what you like with them. If you want to cut them or, make them into collages, because that would have been my obvious response, because I was working in the territory of collage. And somehow I felt that they were just so beautiful. So what you see, the white, dreamlike cyanotypes are the cyanotypes. And I have an archive
Hormazd,
of
I should just stop you there and ask you to explain for any viewers who aren't familiar with cyanotypes how that process works. Because
so
it's
it's a kind of I'm not very quite sure myself, but I will try and explain it. It's a very special kind of paper, which you put into the sun, and if you had nothing on it, it would turn into a cyan blue, beautiful block like photography. But if you start putting things on them to block the sun, then it leaves these shapes behind, usually in white and shades of lighter blue. So for example, artists leave flowers and leaves, and if you lift them back, then the imprint is left behind. So it's like a shadow being left behind.
beautiful.
And when I put the yellow, their lingerie patterns on top in certain angles, in certain ways, they looked like abstract birds that left these shadows behind in exactly the way I explained how a cyanotype is made. But it also reminded me of, when birds fly, they leave shadows on the ground. And it made me think of, I called it birds of passage, and it made me think of migratory birds and how birds move from one country to another just to survive and to escape the change in climate. And it made me think of my own migration coming to the UK from India as a gay man. And I wanted to sort of, express myself and be my most authentic self. And it also made me think of how gay people have had to move from towns and other cities to more metropolitan cities like London, and from then countries to other countries. And, you know, so that's why I called it Birds of Passage. And then the artist book feels like it's taking off, with um the pages coming out of the box, in a sort of I've forgotten the technical word, but the fold outs feels like they're opening.
I think we can really see that in that photo, and I'm struck also how that again is quite a circular journey, as you say, exploring your own migration in many senses, um, and tying up how you were inspired by another artist, but you're also your partner has been involved in sort of collaborative process there,
Yeah.
and how you've taken that forward. And also, the color and shapes are very striking in that and fit very much into the pattern making that you've established as a really dominant interest. So it seems again a real progression of your work, but drawing on those elements that have gone before.
Correct. And also, um, as you said, my partner and I collaborate quite a lot. So he's a graphic designer, and he designed the book and the box and the way the text was laid out and the cover. And so there's a real sort of synergy in how we work. And I really recommend people to go to the museum to see the book, because the pictures don't do it justice. But when you turn the pages behind, there are vector drawings of each of the panels. So there's a lot of thought that's gone through every part of the book, you know. And I think that artist books have played a really important role in my practice, because of the link to patterns being, you know, materiality of paper, and the idea that patterns are documents and they're books in their own right, because they're storing information, which is used to make a suit or a garment. And so there's a real link between artist books and patterns, I feel. So and I've made quite a few of them over the years. Almost every year I try and do an artist book, because I think they're just very exciting.
Fantastic. And we can just about see some of the drawings there that you were talking about. So if we move, I've just forward to the next image, but I've just included a couple of photographs with credits. Not quite sure who the photographer is, but it's a
So this
beautiful.
is Hayden Berrier, correct?
Okay, so many thanks to the photographer there. But this really gives us a sense of you at work. We can see some of the patterns there behind you near the window, and then the way you're working there with collage on the table. So I've really just included a couple of those to give viewers a bit more of the idea of your process. But I know we're going to move along to the next piece, and a beautifully curated wall, if I may say so. Okay, so we arrive at 20.
I think, would you mind just going back to the
Yeah,
last? I
sure.
think it'd be nice to just say something here. So these four works were basically looking at how the intersection between figuration and abstraction. And so the two abstract works that you see were following strict codes of geometry, and that was pretty much what I was making for almost 4 to 5 years. But then they suddenly started turning into figures. So the one on the far left, I called it homage to Moore. So it looks like a sculpture of Moors reclining and listening to music, but it has that very sort of sculptural aspect. Then the one to the right is called The Prince, and basically it's a mother raising a child. And so there's that thing of having two figures within the pattern. And then the work next to it is called The Wave, and it's about someone waving, and it's all about one gesture coming out of the composition. And then the long piece on the far right side is called Remember Who You Are. So there's, again, reference to religious iconography, but a lot of people have also thought that it looks like Egyptian iconography. And so the figures were quite starting to evolve by then. And then if we go to the next slide, it ties in really well to that figure, which was commissioned by 45 Park Lane for the King's coronation, and they wanted me to come up with an abstract work celebrating that historic moment in British history. And I found this pattern which had these gestures on the crown, and it felt like they were hands that were placing the crown on the figure's head. So there was, the idea of the king becoming the king. And it's strange because at the time people are like, oh, we don't see Charles as the king yet, because the Queen had such a huge tenure as a monarch. But I kind of instantly thought, wait till you see the regalia, the robes, the crown, the orb, the scepter, all the symbolism. Really, it's the clothing and the idea of transformation, and then you'll understand this moment. And it was true when we saw it happening, we then came into our consciousness of that, yes, we have a king now, we have a new monarch. And I used Japanese silks and reds and blues to sort of represent the the colors of the of royalty, and distressed gold and purple were used to again pick up colors of the crown, the orb, the scepter. And once the artwork was made, it was then translated into 80 flags that covered the entire facade of the hotel building to celebrate the coronation. And then beautiful hand-finished prints were commissioned to be given away. And one of them is in the V&A collection, and one is in House Gallery's permanent collection. And it's also actually on show currently in their pattern exhibition where we met a week and a half ago.
Fantastic. And yes, it's lovely to hear a bit more about the textiles that you used, which just sound very beautiful and rich and historic in themselves. And so not necessarily reflecting this ceremony, but reflecting those kind of ideas behind it. And I guess that's the kind of purple that we associate with royalty there, near the head. And did you have a response from the palace? Were they aware of the piece?
They sent us a letter thanking us for our contribution to the coronation. And 45 Park Lane were really very excited about it, and I was quite excited about it. And it um, it was really well received. And the flags were, sure, they were abstract and they were not, literal um, drawings, and they didn't want it to be literal. They wanted it to be very abstract, and they wanted the art to take over the celebrations.
Well, I was lucky enough to see the flags, and they were incredibly effective, fluttering in the breeze, very colourful, very striking.
Thank you.
So if we move to the next piece, and I know you're going to tell us more about your continuing process and this work with collage. So this is just one example of the kind of work you do.
So this series is called Flying Over Aspen, and it was commissioned by a private collector who lives in Aspen. And she can see the famous mountains in Aspen, and wanted me to create a work that had a reference to it. And so if you look at the way the collage has been made, there's a lot of white, gray, blue, black, and to create each piece. And the blue, there's a lot of sky-like sort of painted papers. And it made me think that when you look at a mountain range, the sky plays quite an important part in to create the mountain range, in the sense that you can see an outline of the mountains, but then they merge into the sky, and then they merge into the snow and the ground. And so I wanted to create all that. But I chose this piece because it made me also think that there was a moment where I really wanted to go big, and I was sort of being restricted because I was making work on original patterns. And I patterns only come in certain sizes because we as humans are of certain sizes. So they're not going to be, 3 feet, three, 4, 5
Meters
feet
tall,
sheet
yeah.
papers. And so it sort of was an example of what my collages would look like. And then I wanted to also then talk about me moving into the territory of painting, where I've gone much bigger.
And I think we'll see that later on as well. And is this the beginning of your painting, Hormazd, or does that come?
It sort of was because I was using painted papers, it was a sense of me wanting to move into brush strokes and painting, but I was still very married to the idea of making it a collage, and it was cutting paper and working. So I was trying to sort of step out of the way I used to think by working with painted papers. It was almost like how Matisse made the paper cuts, where the papers were painted and then cut. And he was sort of talking about painting with his scissors. And so I was borrowing that thought by using painted papers when making these collages. But now, if we move on,
Sure.
maybe we can come back to that. It's the
Okay.
same concept, but I like this piece, for instance. It's much bigger. It's 150 by 100 centimeters. It's probably the same size as the 10 put together, but it's completely painted on canvas. So um I've I've photographed the patterns in high resolution and blow them up and then paint them and print them on canvas and then work on them. So there's a lot of techniques of gilding also that's been incorporated into the work. So the experience is really different. So if we go back to one again, and this one is called Homage to Althea, and Althea was a very talented textile designer from the 80s and 90s, and she's getting a lot of resurgence and interest in her work. She's passed away, but the Migrations Museum again commissioned me to make this work inspired by her. So if you went really close, you'll see hand painted papers that were then cut up, and they were inspired by her textile art, to then create these very formal compositions. And incidentally, this work is going to be on show at the Woolwich Contemporary Print Fair that opens on Wednesday. So that's why I thought I'd also include it as something that's happening in London. So this is really when I sort of was, it was like a supernova, where it was just sort of something was happening and brewing in terms of the painting aspect of my practice was there, but I would still not see them as paintings. I'd see them as collage. But also, I'd like to say that I'm painting in the same language as I would make a collage, but it's just a very different. The dragging of the brush strokes onto the canvas is just another delightful experience for me. So I'm sort of working in the same way of creating a composition, of
And tell
composing my.
me, when you're envisaging each part of it, do you sort of think about the collage elements and as if sort of placing them together first before you start doing that, either with collage or with paint or with painted elements, or do you just go kind of entirely
Yeah,
intuitively and
intuitively and committed. I commit to it, and it's like go through it and not think. And either it's a complete success or a complete disaster, and accepting it and then moving on to the next one, but learning through your mistakes. So I think that also in art making, a lot of artists would agree that they're not really mistakes, they're just you're exploring. And unless it's a commission with a very purist sort of structure that you have to abide by, then when you're making art, it's not about making mistakes. It's about making choices and decisions. And I don't plan any of the works, apart from the Royal Geographical Society that we'll talk about. That's the only work that had a lot of planning, and it was, a really new experience for me. For me, it's about just, you know, I guess it's like contemporary dance, and freestyle, where you're just feeling a moment and you're putting it out there and manifesting a feeling. And I feel that's how my art making process has always been.
And that's an interesting analogy, because there's certainly a lot of energy and movement through the pieces, partly because of the collage, but also how you assemble that together. But something that strikes me, and I know you talked a long time ago when you talked a little bit about David Bomberg and sort of, the idea of pieces like Mud Bath, which have that kind of breaking up of the surface, but also that energy and movement, and also a kind of picturing of displacement and those kind of ideas within it. And those kind of affinities to sometimes earlier movements like Vorticism, or the kind of work that was done also by someone like Edward Wadsworth. Is that something that ever goes through your mind? Or do you just feel, there are perhaps some resonances with earlier pieces, but they're not at all intended or conscious?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, of course, there's some pieces like the coronation piece had to sort of have elements of the symbols in the ceremony, and the hotel were quite free in their brief, and they said do whatever you want and do whatever you feel is right, um, which is a basically a sort of an open blanket to say do whatever you like. But actually, in reality, if I did do whatever I liked and it didn't meet their expectations, then I'd have to start all over again. But the first work that I did absolutely felt that it hit all the notes and all the right points, that they just said, you can stop now. This is, you've achieved what we wanted to do. So I think that in that sense, it was very prescribed and structured. But these works were also, she's a textile artist, so it was about
Yeah.
the decoration and the textile element to it that was being referenced, but not
Yeah.
actual compositions. And then I could do, whatever I felt like in terms of the piece. So I think that I've been lucky that in the last sort of 12 years of my career, I've never ever had an instance where I thought this was completely not what I wanted to do, because I've always wanted to do what the work I wanted to make.
Oh, well, it's fantastic to have that resonance with her work, which, as you say, is being really revisited and rediscovered now. There's been kind of a number of initiatives in the past few years. And of course, your work is again very resonant with that idea of textiles, which is kind of where it started, I guess. So if we go next, we talked a little bit about this piece, so we go on to this piece. And what would you like to tell us about that?
So I chose this work because I wanted to sort of say that, all this time the compositions were just being very sort of formal geometry, but now it's just sort of burst of expressionism, and it was basically a pattern that I found that had, a little circle. So all the circles were gilded. And then I did this real washed out painting with, sort of elements of Monet's garden, for instance, that came out. And also, this is going to be on a cover of an upcoming book that's going to be released, not mine, but it's being used. And I find it very interesting because it's a complete change in how I'm working in terms of the compositions being made. And this is completely painted on canvas and is a really large canvas, simply because I've been able to print the patterns onto canvas and then work on them. So I thought that this would be an interesting work that's representing the next step and the next wave of my work.
And I imagine that feels quite freeing to work on that scale and with the paint and on the canvas directly. And it looks like a really different overall effect to those pieces that we've looked at so far, and the color scheme as well, and the way that it merges and sort of becomes submerged and is then picked up with highlight colors. Again, is that an instinctive balance that you achieve just by thinking, yes, I need more pink here, or did you have a scheme in mind before you began?
I think, yeah, as you said, it's very intuitive, but also it's the collages were taking much longer to make because you had to, if you stuck it down in the wrong space or the wrong way, then the collage is sort of ruined because the patterns are so fragile that if you try to take it out, they would tear. And I think that in respect to the painting, I just want to be it's extremely free when I make the works, and there's no sort of rules in terms of how much time it took to make, or I put on loud music and then just wash the painting. And I also a year and a half ago hired a studio technician with lots of skills in the territory of painting and gilding. So I sort of been finding a new way of making art by her being there in terms of washing the piece. And this piece, I started making it, and instantly within 5 minutes, I regretted it and said, "Oh, this is a disaster." And she very calmly said, "Trust the process, trust yourself, just finish it. You always liked finishing something when you started." And she was right. And then we washed it, and then went painted it again, put the colors in. And I suddenly started thinking about a garden in space, and how geometry also works in space. Geometry is such a purist form of seeing and understanding something, that it transforms itself from the body to space. And I think that that's what I was trying to capture within this work.
That's very beautiful. Okay, and then we move to this piece here, which looks to be again on a very large scale. Is that?
So these were on 6 panels, and they were again painted in a very sort of washed way, and just very free with free brush strokes. And then I looked at it, and my instinct of collage just keeps creeping back in. So we had like a pile of very brightly colored papers that were painted, and I started cutting them up and putting them in various spots, and they feel like they've been just thrown there. But if you look carefully, they're all following the intersections of the pattern. So there's a lot of conscious decision making when creating those pieces. And a big hero of mine is Paul Klee, and I feel like I really absolutely can stare at a clay for hours and hours. And I felt like I wanted to bring that energy in this piece. So it was sort of, the pieces that we were talking about were in the territory of collage, but they were using hand painted papers. And then the other works that we talked about were pure paintings. And then this is then a painting, but then uses collage. So it's all about how the processes move. And I borrow from different mediums and way of working to create a piece, because in my opinion, the final composition takes precedence in how it's seen and how it's made.
And I have to say that one in particular just really emanates joy with all that colour, and I think it's just exactly what we need at this gloomy time of year. Yeah. So we move now to the present day and your latest installation, which is this 15-panel painting on canvas, which is cited at the Royal Geographical Society London. And we can see there how you've really specifically, cited it into that space. It just fits there beautifully. And I had the pleasure of seeing it in the flesh a few days ago. And obviously we're looking here at the effect you get from a distance, but one can go close up. I think we go a little closer. Oh no, perhaps that's a little further away. But we can see people standing in front of it there, which gives us the scale of it. And perhaps if I just go back to the previous slide, you'd like to tell us a bit more about the whole thing, how it came about and how long it took and the kind of processes you were using to make it, because I know you've told me a bit about that, and it's a really extraordinary thing altogether. So it would be lovely to hear about it in some more detail.
So the Royal Geographical Societies invites artists to mount shows in the director's gallery, and initially that was what was offered to me. And I used to visit the society, and every time I went into the map room, and this wall used to be empty, and there was nothing there. And I just kept saying to him, like, to the director, like, wow, I wish I could get that wall. And then one day I get a call from him and says, if you want the wall, you can have it. But let's come up with a structure in terms of how the artwork is going to be viewed. So we decided that it will be on display for 5 years. And that one of the remits was that I research into the archive and took elements of the archive and used them within the work. And when the photo doesn't, actually do it justice, but, you really have to see it in real. And we have a tour planned on December 11th if people would like to join. Um, and I wanted to make the work as an abstract map of the universe. And I used 1920s German sewing patterns, which were incredibly dense with little circles that reminded me of astronomical charts. And my sort of job as an artist is sort of question what is a map in the context of the society. And I did not use any of the traditional maps within the work. These were all sewing patterns that looked like maps. But what I did use from the archive were mythological um, beautiful drawings of sea monsters and heads and fishes and half fish and half human, like mermaids and mermans, and Greek mythologically that were printed on 15th century maps. And even in those sort of um, in the realms of fantasy, there was still truth there, because what they were trying to say is don't go to that part of the sea. It's, filled with suspicious things like monsters, and, basically saying avoid those currents. And whilst those research was being carried out, India had successfully sent a space mission to the moon. And so if you see in the painting, there are these ships that are going from Earth to the moon, and those ships were taken out from a Victorian map drawn by an Indian naval officer, and hand drawing of the Red Sea in different ports of the Red Sea. And so those ships were like a metaphor to the space mission, but also early civilizations had this romantic idea of going into space on ships. And then it just opens and expands into the universe, and the universe, it is then completely imaginary with planets. And again, using all my sort of 12 years of art making, and the way I choose color, it was just a total intuition on how it was being made. But what I was talking about earlier, about how I let the piece become what it is, but in this case, these had to be planned because it had to fit on the wall. There were loads of tests that were done. Each panel was made according to the size of the wall. So it all took precedence when the piece was being made. So it was almost like 3.5 months of research, 3 months of planning, and then 3 to 4 months of making the work and then framing it thereafter. So it took almost over a year to achieve. And there's a lot of gilding techniques and paintings, but the paintings all stay within the line. And then if you go really close into the work, you'll see the different colors that are used to paint the shapes within the installation. And I'm all about balance. And so it's about making sure that each panel is balanced so it looks like one complete piece rather than pieces that are being brought together.
And yes, it's a shame we can't share the detail, but we urge people to come and join that tour to see the detail, because we should say, unfortunately, the building can't be open all the time. So it's a case of making an appointment to
That's
be
right.
on one of these tours and so on. But certainly there is incredible detail in each one. And I loved that resonance between the kind of historical journeys and thinking of those old maps with the, there be dragons kind of messages, and then the idea that you've turned that actually into this modern journey, the journey to the moon, as well. So hence we have this constellations and the expanding universe theme to it. And the idea, I think, is that it will be there for about 5 years, you said.
That's right. Yeah.
And so I think our final shot is a picture of you, in fact, in front of it, which is how we began. And in fact, we can see a little bit more
Yeah.
detail in some of the pictures there. But before we leave you, Hormazd, tell us what's next. What are you working on now, and what kind of plans do you have for the next pieces?
So I'm actually working on a 17-year survey book that traces uh, my art practice from Dead Man's Patterns in 2008, and that's taking a real lot of time trying to edit it. And Emma Hill is editing the book, and I'm really, really excited about it. And I've also been commissioned by Rosewood Hotel for the new Rosewood in Grosvenor Square, which is again really gorgeous works. There's a whole series of work that's framed in one piece on Oscar Wilde, which is really exciting. But besides that, I'm just continuing painting because that's what I feel is what I need to get out and work. And really those are the few things that I'm going to work on. And of course, Woolwich is opening this week till Sunday. So it's pretty exciting.
So we encourage everyone to go there. And at the Rosewood, is there a particular connection? Was Oscar Wilde ever on that site, or is that just you drawing on
No,
inspiration?
he used to live on Grosvenor Square, which is the reason why I suggested doing a work on Oscar Wilde. So he lived on Grosvenor Square, yeah.
Yeah, lovely.
And
So
he'd often walk in the park square to sort of clear his head and write stories. So there's lots of connotations of birds sitting on his lapels, and there's telling him stories in the same way animals interact with Frida Kahlo in her portrait. So I did use the same references when making the Oscar Wilde works. And there's also lots of queer references, and putting forward like two Oscars hand in hand. So it's a really beautiful, it's a really beautiful body of work.
Oh, lovely. Well, we look forward to seeing that there. And will that be in the sort of lounge areas, or is
Yeah,
it?
it's in a very prominent
Yeah,
place in the center of the hotel. Like the other pieces are made for private rooms and the bedrooms, so that's not seen. But this piece is going to be quite a focal point in the hotel.
fantastic. Well, we look forward to going in, taking tea in front of that and paying homage to Oscar at the same
Yeah.
time. So I really want to thank you, Hormazd, for being with us today,
No, it's
taking
my
us through
pleasure.
that journey of your work and so many beautiful pieces and culminating in this fantastic piece at the Royal Geographical Society. So we hope people will come to the gallery and see the work there, but obviously there are all these other places in London where your work can also be seen and enjoyed. So thank you, Hormaz,
Thank
and
you. Thank you, Sarah.
keep up the good work.
Take care and see you soon. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.